The story begins in a quiet suburban neighborhood where I, Steve, and my wife Amanda have lived for the past 10 years. Our marriage, which seemed like a fairy tale, now felt like a distant memory. Recently, things had started to feel off, like a subtle shift in the atmosphere that I couldn't quite put my finger on. Amanda and I had been married for 13 years, and while our relationship had its ups and downs, I always believed we were solid. However, over the past few months, a nagging feeling of doubt had begun to creep into my mind. Amanda and I both worked demanding jobs, but we always made time for each other, or at least, we used to. Lately, Amanda had been spending more and more time away from home, claiming she had work obligations or social events with friends. At first, I didn't think much of it. After all, she was a social butterfly, and her job often required late nights and networking. But as the nights she spent out grew more frequent, so did my suspicions. One Friday evening, Amanda announced she was meeting up with an old friend from college, someone she hadn't seen in years. Her excitement seemed genuine, but something about the way she hurried out the door set off alarm bells in my head. As I watched her drive away, I couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't being entirely truthful. My mind raced through countless scenarios, each one more troubling than the last. That night, as I sat alone in our living room, the silence was deafening. I tried to distract myself with a movie, but my thoughts kept drifting back to Amanda. I couldn't help but wonder who this old friend really was, and why she was so eager to see him. I had no reason to doubt her fidelity before, but the inconsistencies in her stories were becoming too blatant to ignore. I decided to reach out to a few mutual friends to see if they knew anything about this mysterious friend. To my dismay, no one seemed to have any information. It was as if Amanda had kept this part of her life hidden from everyone, including me. This only fueled my suspicions further. Determined to get to the bottom of things, I started paying closer attention to her behavior, looking for any clues that might explain the changes in her routine. Over the next few weeks, I noticed several red flags. Amanda was increasingly protective of her phone, often taking calls in private or abruptly ending conversations when I entered the room. She also started dressing differently, opting for outfits that were more revealing than her usual attire. While she claimed it was just a way to boost her confidence, I couldn't help but feel there was more to it. One evening, I stumbled upon a series of text messages on Amanda's phone while she was in the shower. The messages were from someone named Jake, and they were filled with flirtatious banter and inside jokes that hinted at a deeper connection. My heart sank as I scrolled through the messages, each one confirming my worst fears. It wasn't just the content of the messages that bothered me, but the frequency and intimacy they shared. The next morning, I decided to confront Amanda. As we sat at the breakfast table, I casually mentioned that I had seen the messages from Jake. Her reaction was immediate and defensive. She accused me of invading her privacy and insisted that Jake was just an old friend from college. But the look in her eyes told a different story. There was a flicker of guilt, quickly masked by anger and deflection. Despite her reassurances, my trust in Amanda was shattered. The doubt that had been simmering beneath the surface now consumed my thoughts. I couldn't ignore the signs any longer. I knew I had to find out the truth, no matter how painful it might be. The suspicion gnawed at me, driving a wedge between us that seemed impossible to bridge. As the days turned into weeks, the tension between us grew. Amanda's late nights continued, and my anxiety worsened. I felt like a stranger in my own home, constantly second-guessing her every move. I began to question everything I thought I knew about our marriage and the woman I had vowed to spend my life with. Little did I know, the truth was about to turn my world upside down. The following weeks were a haze of anxiety and sleepless nights. Every glance, every unexplained absence, every hushed phone call pushed me closer to the edge. I couldn't focus at work, my mind always drifting back to Amanda and the shadow of doubt that loomed over our marriage. I knew I couldn't continue living like this, but I also knew I needed more concrete evidence before confronting her again. One evening, when Amanda mentioned she was heading out for another work event, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I followed her, keeping a safe distance to avoid detection. My heart pounded in my chest as I tailed her car through the city. She eventually pulled into the parking lot of an upscale restaurant. I watched as she got out of the car, her face lighting up with a smile that I hadn't seen in months. She walked inside and was greeted by a tall, well-dressed man, Jake. I parked my car a few blocks away and approached the restaurant on foot. Through the large windows, I could see them seated at a corner table, their heads close together, laughing and talking with an intimacy that made my stomach churn. It was clear this wasn't a casual dinner between old friends. They were engrossed in each other, completely oblivious to the world around them. I took out my phone and snapped a few photos of them together, my hands shaking with a mix of anger and heartbreak. I felt like a detective gathering evidence for a case I never wanted to be involved in. After a few minutes, I couldn't bear to watch any longer. I turned away, my mind reeling with the implications of what I had just witnessed. Back at home, I sat in the dark, staring at the photos on my phone. The undeniable proof of Amanda's betrayal was right there in front of me, and yet I still struggled to accept it. I knew I needed to confront her, but I also knew that doing so would mean shattering any remaining illusion of our happy marriage. I decided to wait until she returned home, giving myself time to calm down and think about my next steps. Amanda came home late that night, her demeanor cheerful and carefree. She kissed me on the cheek and chatted about her work event, completely unaware that I knew the truth. The sheer audacity of her lies made my blood boil, but I forced myself to stay calm. I needed to approach this carefully, to ensure that I didn't lose my temper and make the situation even worse. The next day, I decided to dig deeper. I went through her phone records, emails, and social media accounts, looking for any additional evidence of her affair with Jake. What I found only confirmed my suspicions. There were countless messages and calls between them, many of which were hidden or deleted. It was clear that they had been in contact for a long time, carefully covering their tracks to avoid detection. I also discovered a series of photos of them together, some taken at the restaurant and others in more intimate settings. Each image was a dagger to my heart, driving home the reality of Amanda's betrayal. It was as if I was piecing together a puzzle of my broken marriage, each new discovery adding another layer of pain and disillusionment. That evening, I decided it was time to confront Amanda. I couldn't live with the constant suspicion and deceit any longer. As we sat down to dinner, I took a deep breath and told her we needed to talk. She looked up at me, her eyes wide with surprise and a hint of nervousness. "I know about you and Jake," I said, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "I've seen the messages, the photos. I've even seen you together." Amanda's face turned pale, her fork clattering to the table. For a moment she seemed at a loss for words, her mouth opening and closing as she struggled to respond. Finally, she took a deep breath and began to speak. "Steve, it's not what you think," she said, her voice trembling. "Jake is just an old friend. We were catching up, that's all." I shook my head, anger and sadness welling up inside me. "Don't lie to me, Amanda. I've seen the messages, the photos. I've followed you. I know the truth." Her eyes filled with tears, and she buried her face in her hands. "I'm so sorry, Steve," she whispered. "I never meant for this to happen. It just got out of control." The raw emotion in her voice took me by surprise. For a moment, I felt a pang of sympathy for her, but it was quickly overshadowed by the overwhelming sense of betrayal. "Why, Amanda? Why did you do this? Was our marriage not enough for you?" She looked up at me, her eyes red and puffy. "I don't know," she admitted. "I was feeling lonely, disconnected. Jake and I reconnected on social media, and it just happened. I know that's not an excuse, but it's the truth." Her words cut deep, but they also provided a sense of clarity. This wasn't just about Jake. It was about deeper issues in our marriage that we had failed to address. As much as her betrayal hurt, it also made me realize that we both had a role in the breakdown of our relationship. We talked late into the night, airing our grievances and trying to make sense of what had happened. It was a painful conversation, but it was also necessary. For the first time in months, we were truly communicating, laying bare our emotions and vulnerabilities. It was a small step towards understanding, but it was also the beginning of a long and difficult journey. As the days passed, the initial shock of Amanda's betrayal gave way to a simmering anger that refused to be quenched. The hurt was raw and unrelenting, and while we tried to talk things through, the trust between us was irrevocably shattered. I couldn't stand the thought of them continuing their affair behind my back, and I knew I had to confront Jake directly. The opportunity presented itself sooner than I expected. Amanda mentioned she was meeting Jake again, this time at the same upscale restaurant where I had first seen them together. She tried to reassure me, claiming it was just to clear the air. but I wasn't buying it. Determined to put an end to this charade, I decided to follow her once more. That evening, I waited in the parking lot until Amanda and Jake arrived. My heart raced with a mix of dread and adrenaline as I watched them enter the restaurant. This time, I wasn't going to sit back and collect evidence. I was going to confront them head on. I marched into the restaurant, my anger boiling over with each step. I spotted them at their usual corner table, laughing and talking as if they didn't have a care in the world. The sight of them together, so carefree and intimate, was the last straw. Without a second thought, I stormed over to their table. "What the hell is this?" I shouted, my voice echoing through the restaurant. Heads turned, and the room fell silent as all eyes focused on our table. Amanda and Jake looked up, stunned. Jake quickly stood up, but before he could say a word, I swung my fist, hitting him squarely in the jaw. He stumbled backward, knocking over a chair as he fell to the ground. Amanda screamed, and the restaurant erupted in chaos. "Steve, stop!" Amanda cried, rushing to Jake's side. "What are you doing?" "What am I doing?" I yelled, my voice shaking with fury. "What are you doing, Amanda? You think you can just sneak around with this guy and expect me to sit back and take it?" Jake struggled to his feet, wiping blood from his mouth. "Steve, calm down," he said, his voice steady, but his eyes betraying his fear. "This isn't the place for this." "Shut up," I snapped, advancing on him. "You don't get to tell me to calm down. You've been sneaking around with my wife for months. Do you have any idea what that feels like?" The restaurant manager hurried over, trying to defuse the situation. "Sir, you need to leave," he said firmly, placing a hand on my arm. "We can't have this kind of behavior here." I shook him off, my eyes still locked on Jake. "I'm not done with you," I growled. "This isn't over." Amanda stood between us, her eyes filled with tears. "Please, Steve, just go home. We can talk about this later." I took a step back, my chest heaving with anger. "There's nothing left to talk about," I said coldly. "You made your choice." Turning on my heel, I stormed out of the restaurant, leaving a stunned silence in my wake. As I drove home, the adrenaline began to wear off, replaced by a crushing sense of betrayal and sadness. The confrontation had given me a momentary release, but it hadn't solved anything. If anything, it had only made the situation worse. When I got home, I felt a surge of determination. I wasn't going to let Amanda stay in our home any longer. She had made her choice, and now she had to face the consequences. I went through the house, gathering all of her belongings. Clothes, shoes, personal items, everything that belonged to her was thrown into suitcases and garbage bags. With each item I collected, my anger flared anew. The memories attached to these objects now felt tainted, each one a reminder of her betrayal. I worked quickly, my movements fueled by a mix of rage and heartbreak. When I had finished, I carried the bags and suitcases to the front porch, dumping them unceremoniously in a pile. The porch light cast a harsh glow on the heap of belongings, a stark contrast to the darkness I felt inside. I locked the front door and retreated into the house, feeling a grim sense of satisfaction. Amanda would come home to find her things on the porch and realize just how serious I was. There was no going back from this. Hours later, Amanda returned. I watched from the window as she approached the porch, her expression shifting from confusion to horror. She stood there for a moment, staring at the pile of her belongings, before knocking on the door. "Steve, please open the door," she called, her voice shaking. "We need to talk." I ignored her, my heart pounding in my chest. She knocked again, more urgently this time. "Steve, please, let me in." Finally, I opened the door, but only a crack. "There's nothing left to talk about, Amanda," I said coldly. "You can stay with Jake or find a hotel. You're not staying here." Her eyes filled with tears as she realized the gravity of the situation. "Steve, I'm sorry. I made a mistake. Please, let's talk about this." I shook my head, my resolve unwavering. "You made your choice, Amanda. Now you have to live with it." With that, I closed the door, shutting her out. I leaned against it, feeling the weight of the evening's events crash down on me. The house was eerily quiet, a stark contrast to the chaos that had erupted earlier. I knew I had made the right decision, but it didn't make the pain any easier to bear. As the hours passed, I tried to find some semblance of peace. I knew the road ahead would be difficult, but I was determined to move forward. Amanda had betrayed me, and there was no undoing the damage she had caused. All I could do now was focus on healing and rebuilding my life, one step at a time. In the days following Amanda's eviction from our home, a cold determination took hold of me. The confrontation had given me a grim sense of satisfaction, but it wasn't enough. Amanda and Jake needed to feel the full consequences of their actions. I wasn't going to let them walk away unscathed. First, I focused on Jake. One evening, I called up my closest friends, Tom, Dave, and Mike, and explained the situation. They were outraged on my behalf and readily agreed to help. We made a plan to confront Jake directly, ensuring he would understand the gravity of his actions and be too afraid to ever contact Amanda again. Late one night, we drove over to Jake's house. My heart raced with a mix of fear and exhilaration. I wasn't sure if what we were about to do was right, but the need for revenge overpowered any doubts. We parked a block away and walked silently to his front door. Tom knocked, and when Jake opened the door, he was met with a punch to the gut from Dave, doubling him over in pain. "What the hell?" Jake gasped, looking up at us with wide eyes. "Steve, what are you doing?" "You know exactly what this is about," I said coldly. "You ruined my marriage. Now it's time to face the consequences." Mike grabbed Jake by the collar and dragged him inside, slamming the door shut behind us. We pushed him onto the couch and I stood over him, my anger boiling to the surface. "If you ever contact Amanda again," I said, my voice low and dangerous, "you'll regret it. Do you understand me?" Jake nodded frantically, his face pale with fear. "I understand. I swear, I'll stay away from her." "Good," I replied, leaning closer. "And if I find out you've gone near her, I'll make sure you regret it even more." With that, we left his house, leaving him trembling on the couch. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a start. The confrontation had given me a sense of power and control that I desperately needed. Next, I turned my attention to Amanda. I wasn't going to resort to violence, but I wanted everyone to know what she had done. I gathered all the evidence I had: messages, photos, emails, and made copies. Then, I sent packets to her family, friends, and coworkers detailing her betrayal and infidelity. The fallout was immediate and brutal. Amanda's parents were devastated, her siblings furious. Her friends were shocked and disgusted. At work, her reputation took a hit as whispers and rumors spread. She became a pariah, shunned by those who had once admired her. It wasn't enough to make up for the pain she had caused me, but it was a start. As for our marriage, there was no going back. The trust was gone, and the love we once shared was tainted by her betrayal. We decided to divorce, and I made sure to hire the best lawyer I could find. I wanted to ensure that Amanda would be left with as little as possible. The divorce proceedings were long and bitter, but in the end, I was granted the house, most of our savings, and custody of our dog. Amanda was left with a small alimony payment and the realization of what she had lost. With the divorce finalized, I sent out one final round of evidence, this time to Amanda's employer. I wanted to make sure her professional life was as ruined as her personal one. Within a week, she was fired, her reputation in tatters. It was a cruel move, but I felt justified. She had destroyed our marriage, and now her life was in ruins. As I sat in my newly quiet home, I felt a mix of satisfaction and emptiness. The revenge had given me a sense of closure, but it hadn't erased the pain. I had won the battle, but the war had left me scarred and weary. Now it was time to pick up the pieces and start rebuilding my life. Amanda tried to reach out a few times, begging for forgiveness and another chance, but I was done. I had given her my heart, and she had shattered it. There was no room for her in my future. I needed to find a way to move on, to heal, and to rediscover who I was without her. The road ahead was uncertain, but I knew one thing for sure. I would never let anyone betray me like that again. I had learned the hard way that trust was fragile, and once broken, it could never truly be repaired. It was a painful lesson, but one that would guide me as I navigated the next chapter of my life.